In October 1973, the price of oil quadrupled in 90 days. The United States, the world's largest economy, had 72 hours of gasoline reserves. And the crisis wasn't caused by a shortage of oil. It was caused by dependency no one thought to question. For 30 years, cheap oil had powered American prosperity. Factories, highways, suburbs, everything was built on the assumption that oil would always flow. When that assumption broke, the entire economic system seized. Inflation spiked. Unemployment doubled. Growth stopped. The pattern that emerged in 1973 wasn't about oil. It was about what happens when critical supply chains become invisible until they vanish overnight. This is Economic Pattern Vault, where we break down financial history to understand how markets actually work by studying how they fail. Each video uncovers the repeating patterns behind economic booms, debt cycles, and power shifts, so you can see what's happening beneath the headlines. If you find this breakdown useful, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts or questions in the comments. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated attack on Israel during Yom Kippur. The war lasted 3 weeks, but the economic consequences lasted a decade. Here's what happened beneath the headlines. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, announced an oil embargo against the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, and the Netherlands. These countries had supported Israel during the conflict. The embargo was meant as political leverage, but it exposed something far more dangerous. The United States imported 35% of its oil. Most Americans didn't know that. Policymakers knew, but they believed the supply was secure. OPEC nations had every incentive to keep selling. Oil revenue funded their governments. Cutting exports would hurt them as much as the West. That logic was sound, until it wasn't. Within 2 weeks, gasoline stations across the United States ran dry. Drivers waited in lines for 4 hours. Some stations limited purchases to 10 gallons. Others closed entirely. Fights broke out. Police were called to manage traffic. Governors declared states of emergency. The Federal Energy Office imposed rationing. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could buy gas on odd-number days. Even numbers on even days. Highways were empty. Factories reduced shifts. Airlines cut flights. The economy slowed, not because of demand collapse, but because the fuel to power it disappeared. By December, crude oil prices had risen from $3 per barrel to $12. A fourfold increase. But the real damage wasn't the price. It was the realization. American prosperity was built on a resource it didn't control. Economists had assumed oil markets operated on pure supply and demand. That assumption ignored geopolitics. It ignored the fact that oil-producing nations could, and would, use supply as a weapon when their strategic interests were threatened. The Nixon administration scrambled. They appealed to Saudi Arabia for relief. They pressured Israel to negotiate. They proposed energy independence initiatives. None of it mattered in the short term. The embargo lasted 5 months. By the time it ended in March 1974, inflation had accelerated, the stock market had collapsed, and the United States had entered a recession that would define the decade. What broke first wasn't the economy. It was the assumption that critical resources would always be available because markets demanded them. The pattern that insiders recognized, but most didn't, was this. When a critical input becomes concentrated in the hands of a few suppliers, price is no longer the only variable. Control becomes leverage. Before 1973, oil markets appeared diversified. There were multiple producers. Prices fluctuated, but supply was reliable. What wasn't visible was the degree of consolidation. 7 major oil companies, the Seven Sisters, controlled production and distribution. And behind them, a small group of nations held the reserves. The United States had domestic production, but it was declining. The easy oil had been extracted. New sources were more expensive. Importing from the Middle East was cheaper, so that's what the market chose. Efficiency over security. Insiders in the oil industry saw the dependency building. In 1970, a geologist named M. King Hubbert warned that U.S. oil production had peaked. His analysis showed that domestic supply would decline while demand continued rising. The gap would be filled by imports. But Hubbert's warning was dismissed. The market would adapt. Alternatives would emerge. Technology would solve it. The behavior that created the crisis was this: prioritizing short-term cost efficiency over long-term supply security. The consequence was predictable once you understood the structure. A concentrated supply chain controlled by external actors with political interests would eventually be weaponized, not out of irrationality, out of strategic calculation. When the embargo hit, the companies and industries that had ignored dependency were the ones that suffered most. Airlines, automakers, chemical manufacturers, plastics producers. They had no alternatives, no stockpiles, no backup plans. They had optimized for a world where oil always flowed. The ones who survived best were those who had quietly diversified. Companies that had locked in long-term contracts, built strategic reserves, or invested in alternative inputs before the crisis. The lesson wasn't about predicting the embargo. It was about recognizing structural vulnerability. This same pattern appears today in semiconductor manufacturing. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company produces over 60% of the world's advanced chips. Almost every major technology company depends on TSMC. Smartphones, computers, cars, servers, weapons systems. They all require chips that only a few facilities can produce. The logic is identical to 1973. TSMC is efficient. Their manufacturing is cutting edge. The economics favor concentration. Spreading production across multiple countries would be more expensive and less efficient. But concentration creates the same vulnerability. If Taiwan's chip exports were disrupted by conflict, natural disaster, or policy decision, the global technology supply chain would face the same collapse that hit oil-dependent industries in 1973. Companies couldn't simply switch suppliers. There are no alternatives at scale. Building new semiconductor fabs takes 5 years and billions in capital. The parallel extends to rare earth minerals. China controls 70% of global rare earth refining. These materials are critical for batteries, magnets, and defense systems. Western manufacturers import them because Chinese production is cheaper. The dependency is invisible until it becomes a crisis. The behavior is the same. Optimize for cost. Assume supply will remain available because the market needs it. Ignore the geopolitical reality that suppliers have interests beyond profit. Another parallel, natural gas in Europe. For decades, Europe imported Russian natural gas because it was affordable and convenient. Pipelines were built. Infrastructure was designed around that supply. When geopolitical conflict severed the flow, energy prices spiked, industries shut down, and economies contracted. The pattern repeats because the incentive structure doesn't change. Short-term efficiency always beats long-term resilience until the system breaks. The insight from 1973 is this: market efficiency and supply security are not the same thing. A supply chain can be perfectly optimized for cost and still be catastrophically fragile. The real risk isn't visible in prices or quarterly reports. It's hidden in concentration, dependency, and the assumption that critical resources will always be available because you're willing to pay for them. The companies and nations that navigate these crises aren't the ones predicting when disruption will happen. They're the ones who recognize structural vulnerability early and build resilience before it's needed. That means asking a different question. Not, what's the cheapest option, but what happens if this source disappears? The answer to that question determines whether you're exposed or prepared. The 1973 oil embargo didn't end America's dependency on foreign oil. It took decades of painful adjustment. But the crisis did reveal a truth that many still ignore. The things that seem most reliable are often the most vulnerable. The pattern isn't about oil or chips or any single commodity. It's about the structure beneath the surface. When you see concentration, when you see dependency, when you see the assumption that markets will always provide, you're looking at the same conditions that triggered 1973. Understanding that structure is how you see the next crisis before it becomes obvious. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but financial behavior does. If this breakdown helped you see the pattern more clearly, like the video, subscribe to Economic Pattern Vault, and share your perspective in the comments. Understanding the cycle is how you stay ahead of it.